Tea time.
Welcome everybody! Souldin of the Grin Brothers here, and it's time for another episode of Tea Time. Now then, for today's tea, I shall be having Christmas night tea. It's once again another one of those teas from that Christmas calendar thing. I'm still doing those tea times. It's actually only the 9th of December here, so when I'm recording this. So I'm opening yet another one of the English tea shop's Christmas calendar teas. So for today's tea, we've got Christmas night, a black tea with a recommended brew time of 4 to 5 minutes. And it's an organic black tea with plenty of cinnamon and cocoa, along with additional flavourings of cloves, licorice and vanilla. So yeah, it sounds like it's going to be a pretty sweet tea, because, you know, the cinnamon and cocoa, you know, when I first sort of read its description, it sounded more like a hot chocolate, which I've never been a fan of, so this will be interesting. And I will be trying it without milk. And due to having to pause things earlier, like I've attempted to record this tea time before, but I had hiccups and people were talking, so I've had to restart this tea time. As such, this tea is probably cool enough to drink right now, so I'm going to do something very unusual and actually try out this tea before I even get onto the subject I'm going to be talking about. Here we go. Ah, man. That is very bitter for a supposedly sweet tea. That is insanely bitter. I've only brewed this for 4 minutes and yeah, the cinnamon chocolate don't really come through very much. There's a bit of a tingle to the back of my throat. Oh, okay, no, that's why. Okay, that's a bit of a poor taste there, popping up afterwards. On the very bottom of my tongue, I can taste the clove taste, the sort of clove oil taste, as it were. That's not a nice taste. For some reason, the cinnamon, cocoa, vanilla, they're not coming through very well. I talked about in the previous tea time how the vanilla and orange actually managed to help sandwich the taste of the flavouring of the clove, but this one, no, this one's not doing it. I'm drinking it all down that quickly, but just made it far, far worse. Okay, not a fan of Christmas night, but I feel the addition of milk may help that a lot. So, yeah, I'm definitely going to try that one with milk at some point, and hopefully it'll be an improvement. But otherwise, the clove taste, despite it only being, how much percentage of it was clove? It was like 62% black tea, 12% cinnamon and cocoa, and then like 4% clove, and yet the clove feels like the strongest taste. It's tickling my throat, but not in a good way. So yeah, in the unusual turn of events, I've had my tea, just drink it all, just now. Before we go to even the topic of today's tea time. And for today's tea time, I shall be discussing a topic suggested to me by my friend Beabop, who you may be familiar with from the Feel the Snow Grin Brothers with Others collab, because that's Beabop 307, or Bew 307 she's known in some places. And yeah, along with that, she's also done tea time collabs with me as well. So yeah, when I asked the question for, you know, suggestions for these tea times, because oh my gosh, I've got so many teas I have to drink and try out and do tea times for, she suggested, in her own words, perhaps something to do with what types of games don't need a good story to be enjoyable. And whilst that hardly makes for the snappiest of titles, that's a subject I can try and talk about. Now I'm going to try and stay on topic with this, you know, what games don't need a good story, or perhaps even what games do need a good story, or the impact of sort of story on games to make them good, or good stories on games, yada yada yada. I'm going to try and keep it on topic to that point, but I may stray off into other areas because I've always wanted to talk about something regarding story elements in games, like how games and the unique way of being able to executing a story and what ways they can do that. And so I may end up straying into that sort of topic because when I'm talking about story, I have to obviously bring up story elements. And, you know, because there's a lot of different ways you can talk about stories. You know, what is a story? I even typed it into Google just to have a little bit of an answer here. And Google told me an account of imaginary or real people, an event told for entertainment, which is an insanely broad way of, you know, describing a story. For instance, it doesn't say how the story is told. You know, what elements comprise a story. So is this going to be, you know, this can stray off a few areas. So much like this very explanation has kind of strayed off the point. I'm going to try and focus on what sort of stories, what games don't need a good story, and perhaps what games do need a good story. So, starting off with, when Beabop suggested this idea to me, her example was Minecraft, which is a brilliant thing to start off with because she suggested a game I do not enjoy. Probably for the very same reasons why it actually is enjoyable despite the lack of a story to it. Minecraft is basically virtual Lego. There is no defined story to it. You make your own. It's an open world creation game. This is why I do not like Minecraft, because there is no drive from point A to point B and you're given endless possibilities. I do not care for that in a video game. I'm here to see the authorial intent, as it were. I'm here not to see what I can do myself. I can think of that, or I can do that through writing. I'm here to see what the game developers kind of intended for the point A to point B, and that obviously doesn't happen with Minecraft. It doesn't have a defined story. That said, it's not without story elements. For example, other games where you get to do the sort of like mining and creation stuff, for instance, there's like Terraria, which is in a similar vein to it, and Project Spark, have different elements to them. They differ from Minecraft in various ways, and it's not just in the way they approach the game, in terms of, how they do the gameplay, it's also in terms of the sort of story elements to them. Minecraft, you could try to interpret it as having a story element through its cube-based graphics. And stories ended up evolving from the, those green explosive thingies. Again, this is how much I know about Minecraft. The consistent square-shaped pan, was it Ender Dragon? Oh, creepers, I think the green thingies are, yeah. The Ender Dragon, lore ended up being interpreted from Minecraft. And when we get into stories, really, we all interpret stories somewhat. Like, yes, there's the base form, which is a story, but because of our viewpoint, we'll always interpret stories somewhat differently, even despite what the author wants it to be. It's a real shame for some people who want to have a clear vision for their story, but unfortunately that's always going to be the case. It's going to be interpreted based off... Because basically when we're reading something, it has to kind of... Or enjoying something, or listening to a story, or experiencing a story... I could have just summed it up by experiencing a story so much quicker. We kind of got our own our own viewpoint, and that's kind of a filter as it goes through. So... In reality, whilst the Minecraft story is made up by ourselves through our interpretation, it is technically then all stories are, because we've all got that filter which a story has to be processed through. We all interpret things like that. Likewise, in the case of Project Spark, there's actually background to it, and Terraria as well. Terraria, they introduced playable races. You have a selection of them with their own unique abilities. At that point, they then had to expand with laws and civilization. So whilst you can, go about off your own, there is thus already a story element to it through the background details. And Project Spark, likewise, you had the creation spark going about, and they even made a little bit of a story, which their own little sort of gameplay tutorial thing to show how what could be made through Project Spark. Here's a little game example. And in turn, the invention of the Project Spark gave a kind of a narrative to everything you're creating. Yeah, so that's interesting how, but ultimately these games, whether they were good or not, didn't need the story to really make them good. They were good on, in case of Minecraft, it's because of whatever you could make sort of thing. Another game where I'd say that the selling point for it is hardly the story. Again, we're going to run off the theme of games I don't like. Grand Theft Auto. I do not like Grand Theft Auto. I don't care for it. I don't care for its saying, and the fact that, in general... one of the key things which people seem to not care too much about is its story. People don't really hype up Grand Theft Auto for its single player. They usually hype it up for the fact that you can do whatever you want. You can blow stuff up, the police will chase you down, you can steal, mug people, prostitutes and all that. The story is less of a case of the main focus of the game. It's just giving you something to do within that kind of sandbox game. But the enjoyment comes from messing about in that sandbox. From that point on, you do get some games which do give you more to do within that sandbox and try to drive you more towards the story with less elements which allow you to be as free and chaotic in the sandbox as you want. But generally, Grand Theft Auto is more based around its sandbox element of being a criminal. But that in turn is actually part of its story elements. The game is set up in a way where it encourages you to do that. Like, when I played Watch Dogs, I was a vigilante. Watch Dogs' main character of Aiden, I believe his name was Aiden, it's been a while since I played it, was a vigilante. He wasn't a criminal who was purposely going around blowing stuff up. So I never felt it made so much sense to going about doing that sort of thing unless I had to. Like, if I wanted to quickly sum up Aiden's character, I'd say he's the Punisher. There are criminals and he uses violent means to take them down, but he's not outwardly going to cause terror. Unlike in GTA, where you're a criminal, there's no sort of thought there of, oh, I shouldn't do this, because they kind of encourage you to do what you want to accomplish things, and the stories and objectives, tend to follow that same focus. It's a sandbox where doing whatever you want kind of fits in with the narrative. So in a way, the story does have an impact of it, but it's not kind of what made it enjoyable for a lot of people, I don't feel. Like, whilst, of course, the story elements of the scenario they put you in, the particular depiction, you are a criminal, and the setting of it, which kind of helps encourage the sort of gameplay elements to it, it's never really the driving force, the driving sort of reason as to why you're having fun. Another example would be games with bad stories. In that case, a game with a bad story, which are still fun games to play, I'd say is Kingdom Hearts. Now, Kingdom Hearts started off well enough, but then when you get to the story, from future entries, it kind of got really messy, and the overall story of Kingdom Hearts is pretty terrible because it's just a confused mess. Trying to explain it, is chaotic, and there's like mystery set up to it, but its style of mystery writing is the person not knowing what the actual answer is to the mystery, so they end up making something up, which means that no one would have ever been able to guess the mystery, because the clue that they needed to be able to guess what the mystery was, or be able to tell what the mystery was, didn't exist. So ultimately, Kingdom Hearts isn't a very good story in terms of its pure story. The story is trash, but people enjoy Kingdom Hearts games because it's got really good gameplay, and because, despite the overall narrative being terribly done, and very cliched when it comes to it, it's also filled with Disney and Square Enix references, and so it's got a lot of character and charm to it in terms of, the characters, rather than the actual story itself. It's good. It's got decent characters from, the Disney and Square Enix properties thrown into a bad narrative, but also got good gameplay. And so ultimately, people end up getting attached to it through those elements of the character and the gameplay, rather than the overall narrative. And of course, there are a lot of examples I could try to bring up of games I've enjoyed where the narrative isn't so much the main focus, but I wouldn't say that the narratives or the stories here are bad or neutral. And I wouldn't say that having a lack of them would have, there are games which are good, but they're often made better through good stories. It's not a case of where I'd say, oh, you could remove the story and, it'd be better. It's more, or it'd be just as good if you remove the story. It's more of a case of it'd still be good, even if you remove the story, it just wouldn't be as good. That can come across in kind of weird ways. For instance, you wouldn't think of Mario games with story in it. It's hardly the main focus. However, a good example is the Paper Mario series. The first two Paper Mario games had fantastic stories and fantastic gameplay. And when the Sticker Star rumours came about, of course the problems with Sticker Star was the gameplay as well as the story. It wasn't just one or the other. However, I feel even if it had a good story, the gameplay issues with Sticker Star would have ended up laying it down regardless. Color Splashes, from what I hear, is basically an example of Sticker Star better gameplay, but still let down in the story department quite a bit by its lack of characters. It's apparently better story writing. Color Splash is basically better Sticker Star, but it never really sort of gets up to the area of Thousand Year Door. An example of games which don't have kind of minimal sort of story impact, but you'd be surprised why they have story end up affecting things. Again, sticking to the Mario theme here, well, Super Mario Bros., the original one, you think, oh, there was barely any story to it. It was just, the Princess Peach has been kidnapped by Bowser, Mario goes to save her. But there are little hints that actually do explain story. For instance, one of the original elements of Super Mario Bros. Storyline was that Bowser cursed the citizens of the Mushroom Kingdom into blocks and bricks. The very first level of Super Mario Bros. Is an entirely brick-based area. It fits within the narrative. Whilst it probably was the case that the design of the level was made first and then the story for it was written up second to fit that design of the area, it's still a case of where the story actually kind of influences the game or vice versa, and the story is kind of connected to it. And also, furthermore, Mario hits a block and suddenly a power-up comes out. That's connected to that little story element. They kind of ignored that later on, but there are other story elements which kind of shifted the design of the game, or rather were connected to the design of the game. Super Mario Bros. 3 has a wide assortment of areas because Mario and Luigi are travelling to different areas to save the various kings who have been captured and transformed by the Koopa Kids. The areas that you go to are connected to with a plot line wherein you're going to different areas. You know, why are you going to this area? Here's your reason. It's connected to the fact that there are many different areas that you're visiting. But of course, with those games, we didn't really need much story in order for them to be enjoyable. People could have gone through the manuals, could have ignored the manuals, and had never have even known about these stories. The games were good despite not needing those stories to be good. How the stories add kind of context to them. The stories help improve them to a small degree. And, in Super Mario Bros. Case, that's only a small degree that they help improve him. Like Super Mario 3D World would still be my favourite Mario platformer, with or without its little elements that kind of hint to the story. For instance, the final boss fight uses a power-up. Okay, it's been quite a while. So, spoiler of Super Mario 3D World. The mushroom power, the cat power-up. Bowser uses the cat power-up at the very end. The cat power-up has been used by Mario throughout, and it's kind of a story element in terms of the cat power-up being there. The same thing was apparently done with Super Mario 3D Land involving the raccoon leaf, wherein Bowser ends up using the raccoon leaf himself, sort of thing. Though speaking on the concept of stories enhancing a game, Mario is an example where story isn't needed for the games to still be enjoyable. But you know what? They're appreciated, because a lot of people ended up growing fed up of the new Super Mario Bros. Games. In part because the story never really varied at all. It was kind of the same old tale each time. And that was reflected in terms of its gameplay. You weren't really visiting new areas as anymore. And there wasn't really... And if a story kind of compelled there for a reason to be new areas, that would have led to new areas, and thus it would have affected the gameplay. Likewise, a case of a game where I prefer one over the other, less so for gameplay elements, but more so for story elements, Sonic. I prefer the Sonic the Hedgehog series to the Mario series, and I'd say that story elements are pretty much why. It's why lately I haven't been as invested in the Sonic the Hedgehog series, because, they've had less story elements to them. Like, Sonic Colors was a pretty good game, but its story was very lackluster, so it could hardly compete with even the likes of Sonic Heroes, which had 4 different character narratives and bits of mystery going on back and forth. It wasn't a huge story, but it was certainly more than what Sonic Colors had. And a thing that really helped with the old school Sonic Hedgehog games over the Mario games, in my opinion, which you may be thinking, but wait, there wasn't much huge amounts of story in the old Sonic the Hedgehog games. You had it was just, Eggman turning animals into robots or trying to get the Chaos Emeralds to use for his plan. But again, as I said, the way story can be executed, Sonic would always show a lot more character than Mario, a story element. So that ended up enhancing the Sonic games in terms of their personality connection over, say, the Mario games. And, you have Sonic's idle animations, the opening and ending sequences where Sonic would travel from one area to the next and then connect them all up, sort of thing. And of course, then you've got, the more narrative-focused ones where, of course, they had Sonic Adventure and the like, which, had a much more focus on the story. And so I felt more of a connection with the characters of the Sonic universe than the Mario universe. Otherwise, they're both really good games. The Sonic games and the Mario games, admittedly a lot of the Sonic games have gone, become a little lesser, but the story ended up enhancing the experience and was helping make up for some of the flaws of the Sonic games. Even Sonic 06, I still feel there is some charm to it because it has a story to it. That's kind of where a story is kind of needed. If a game is average or has flaws to it, good story elements are kind of what are needed to help make up for its failings. Azura's Wrath is one of my favourite games. It is easily within top 50. It's one of my favourite games on the PS3. It's not got much in the gameplay department though. The gameplay is good, what little there is of it, but it's mainly a cinematic game, as it were. It's there's very little gameplay and a heavy amount of cutscenes and QuickTime events where you don't actually do much technically. But the story is really gosh damn good. They have a brilliant presentation and execution of its story, and Azura becomes Father of the Year forever because he punches gods because they make his daughter cry, and it's fantastic. And, it's the story helps make up for the game's, lack of gameplay in certain in a lot of the areas, which is a shame because they actually had good gameplay. Like the small soft snippet you get, it's like, this is really enjoyable. I wish I could do more of this. And then it's like, oh, QuickTime events. And likewise, Legacy Undercover. The Lego games aren't exactly amazing. They're pretty average to good sort of thing. But I feel they can become a lot better depending on what stories they're connected to or even what franchise they're based off on. Legacy Undercover I really enjoyed because of the charmingness of the characters and the world that they ended up creating through the story. Alternatively, Lego Star Wars had a lot of charm and humour to it because of the property it was based off on and what they could do with that, both in terms of the gameplay elements and in terms of just making jokes about it in the cutscenes. It's otherwise a pretty standard game. It's nothing amazing, but it feels a lot better because of story elements. I'd say story elements for a few games are kind of like co-op elements. They kind of they're not always the most vital of things. Like, obviously, you need a gameplay to make a game, but you don't need a story to make a game. But much like a co-op, a story always can help enhance a game. However, there are cases, as with Kingdom Hearts, where I feel that the story can end up negatively impacting a game. Another game that could have been maybe somewhat salvaged by a good story would have been Legend of K. If Legend of K had better characters and more charm to it, it would have at least been somewhat tolerable. I'm thinking, oh man, I'm disappointed the game wasn't good, but there's something that can be done with this world and characters. I'd like to see a sequel with better gameplay to help, because I want to see these characters furthermore. However, because the characters and story are atrocious, I don't want to see them attempt to even try and improve it, because they'd have to be trying to improve in two very different areas, and I've already got a very negative stigma on the character. Another case of a story I feel negatively impacting my impression of it, I'm never really going to get a God of War game. I don't like Kratos as a character, and I don't like the sort of style of his world. The game kind of looks like the sort of thing I'd enjoy, the hack and slash sort of game. But the character of Kratos doesn't draw me to it. The story elements to it are actually what kind of negatively affect it to me. And so over other games, which of a similar sort of vein of hack and slash or beat 'em up sort of thing, I would choose them over God of War, not because of the gameplay, but because of the presentation, the story and characters of it. And of course, that's when, again, how stories can impact a game. I feel I may have gone off topic from the focus of, games that are good, without needing a story. But I feel I've sort of talked about how stories can affect games. And it's, of course, a very hard topic for me to discuss because games without stories aren't actually ones I often play. And if I'm honest, I think a lot of games have stories, but they tell them in very different ways. There are very sort of subtle ways they end up telling them. And that's the cool part about games. Games have so many different ways they can tell a story, far more than either books or films could ever hope to do. In a sense, I'd say that games could quite potentially be the best storytelling method ever. But ultimately, my issue is that I don't really care too much for my own story in these games, whilst of course there's always going to be a part of that because you're the one playing, and how you're playing it is going to affect the story in of itself, and there'll be certain choices. I'm more there for the game that the designers have built themselves. Again, it's like why I'm not into modding and sort of thing. I don't care too much about trying to make my own game. I'm here to see what the developer's game is, and thus I'm trying to see what this game's world is rather than my world through a gaming form, as it were. If that makes any sense. But yeah, I hope I've managed to keep on topic to somewhat of a degree. I hope this will at least be a good kicking off point for potentially this conversation, particularly with you, Beabop, if you happen to be watching this tea time. And yeah, feel free to share your thoughts below on the impact of stories in games, be them games which are improved because of stories, or games that are good without needing a story or even a good story to help make them into better games. Yeah, so feel free to share your thoughts below, and cheerio!